Physics Bites,
a science podcast in English
by the students of Notre Dame d'Ascension.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Physics Bites, the physics podcast in English of our students in Notre Dame d'Ascension here. We have a new episode with our junior class working on their carbon emissions project. This week, we're tackling the problem of transport and the transport sector and its carbon footprint. So I have 4 new students here. No co-host this time, so I'm going to let the students present themselves.
Hello, my name is Lola.
So we have Lola, which you might have heard as a co-host on a previous episode.
Hello, my name is Clémence.
Clémence.
Hello, my name is Pauline.
Pauline and...
Hello, my name is Vadim.
And Vadim. So you guys went into some depth talking about the carbon footprint of the transport sector. So why don't we get right into it? Give us a short summary of what you guys talked about. I like the way you divided everything up into 3 main parts of transport, and then you went into details into each one, and then we're going to go into questions of how can we improve the carbon footprint, so that is to reduce the carbon footprint of it, and whatever innovation that you guys found in your researches. So I think, Pauline, you want to begin?
So we did a presentation about the transport and the environmental issues about it, because it's a sector that needs to be improved every day, as it makes a lot of carbon emissions, and it is essential in the lives of everybody on Earth. So we are going to talk about how we can improve and what are the innovations found until this day.
Okay, so how did you guys decide to divide up what we mean by transport? What are the main modes of transport that you guys studied? Vadim?
So we divided it into 3 main parts with the air transport.
Air transport?
Including the freight transport by air, or just tourism. Mm-hmm. Then the land transport, which is the major part of the carbon production in transport.
Right.
And then the maritime transport with boats and all the containers that are...
Right, so air, land, and sea. So you chose to divide it up in terms of modes of transport rather than, for example, commercial versus, touristic and, industrial and, just for resources. All right, so what shall we begin with? Are we beginning with air, land, or sea?
Well, actually, we could answer to the questions that were on...
Sure. However you guys want. You guys are the experts.
Yes.
Okay, so let's go quickly into maybe start with air transport. Okay? Let's start with air transport. What do we mean by air transport? What are the main sources of carbon emissions coming from the air sector, and whatever interesting facts that you guys found about the carbon footprint of air transport? Vadim?
So basically, in air transport, most of the carbon production comes from tourism and touristic planes that are flying through the carrying person to the world.
Mm-hmm. Before we go into details, do you have any numbers for us? Like what percentage of the total carbon footprint comes from air transport, or maybe the total carbon emissions? Yeah.
2% of carbon emissions come
from... global carbon emissions of all of humanity is air transport.
Yes.
Right. So first of all, I found that it was lower than what I expected, because I'd assumed that we talk a lot about flying around and tourism en masse, and so I assumed that would be a much higher percentage, but it's actually 2 to 3%. You guys said, right? Which is not huge, but it is increasing, right? Okay. So you were saying, Vadim?
But in fact, the pollution is increasing, but the amount of planes is also increasing.
Number of planes.
The number of planes is also increasing, which means that the pollution per person in the aeronautic area is the lowest one of the 3.
Okay. Because it's still not as high numbers as we have when it comes to land transport and...
Yes, and even though the numbers of planes is increasing, planes transport is the area that decarbonated the most in transport in the last 50 years.
Okay, and what is the main reason that pollution comes from air transport? What is the main cause of it? Let's go into the science of this a bit.
It's because basically the fuel that is used for planes is very pure. Like it's not
very refined.
Yes, it's not very refined.
So what is the main source? What is the main type of fuel that we use for air transport?
It's
Kerosene, right? Which is one of the derivatives of oil. It's an oil product, right? Which is highly refined. Yeah, I think Pauline, you wanted to add something.
Just that, so people were the researchers were saying that they wanted to make a hydrogen-powered long-haul aircraft.
Maybe we can come to that later on when we're talking about the solutions, right? But in the current state, we don't have any hydrogen-powered planes, right? That we use in a commercial way.
No, not in a commercial way.
We've tested some models, but we'll come back to it because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going in there. Okay. So if I summarize what you're trying to say, Vadim, you're saying that the reason that air transport pollutes is because it's basically combustion of carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels. Okay. Anything more about the sources of carbon, or would you guys rather go into maybe some of the solutions that have been worked on, some of the ways of reducing this emission from air transport? So Vadim?
There is just a statistic that is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
For a person who is doing a trip to New York from Paris,
Mm-hmm.
It's approximately 2.4 tons of CO2,
Right.
which is the global emission that you are supposed to produce in 1 year. So just in a 12-hour, you are producing as much carbon
The equivalent
dioxide,
of 1 year's.
yeah, as you should in 1 year.
Right. So it's very interesting that you bring this up, because while we say that air transport is only 2% of total emissions, basically what you're saying is that it's because most of humanity doesn't fly.
Yes.
But those who fly pollute a lot.
Yeah.
And those who fly are generally, the more well-off you are, the richer the country is, the more advanced the country is. So basically, rich people are the ones, us being part of this rich sort of part of the world, we're polluting a lot, the equivalent of what one human should do most in a 12-hour flight.
Yes.
That's not very, that makes me feel guilty anytime that we fly around now. All right, so should we go on to some solutions you guys found? Maybe so Clémence is aching to get started on this part. So Clémence, or anybody else, what are some of the maybe more cutting edge technologies or thoughts or ideas that we have for maybe reducing the carbon emissions from air transport? Pauline?
There is a company, Airbus and Safran, who are developing an airplane until 2050 with a hydrogen-powered
fuel.
And this could be really life-changing, as it is a greener and more sustainable aviation.
Right. So the question of hydrogen has come up, but can you remind us why hydrogen fuel would be cleaner or just clean compared to our fossil fuels?
Firstly, it produces only a water vapor, so it doesn't make as much as carbon emissions.
Right, and we know water vapor is a greenhouse gas, but it is much, much less important in terms of the effect it would have, and it doesn't stay as long, for example, so that's not a problem.
Yes, and hydrogen has a high energy density, so it means that it can store a lot of energy in a small volume, and it makes it suitable for long-haul flights for tourism.
Okay.
And but it has challenges for hydrogen, as it is highly flammable. So one mistake and the flight could be impacted, and it can cause a lot of damages. And it's also difficult to transport its gaseous form over long distances. So the researchers were thinking of convert hydrogen into a more easily transportable form, such as liquid hydrogen.
Right.
It has a higher density compared to its gaseous form, and it's allowing for more efficient transportation, especially designed cryogenic tanks.
Right. You guys, in general, talked about a whole idea of what you called SAFs, which were sustainable air fuels, right? And so this is one of them. Are there other kinds of fuels that the scientists are working on that would have lower or no carbon impact, which is not hydrogen?
Yes, we have a hybrid.
Okay, so what do you mean by hybrid aircrafts?
Hybrid is when there is two motors.
Right.
So it's when you have a thermic one,
Right.
and when there is poses, like you can replace it with an electric one that charge the airplane and you could use it to fly. But the challenge is that there is really big density for the motors. So
Density in terms of like it's very big?
yeah, it's big, and like there was actually a try on a plane. So it needed six
Motors?
motors of electric and one thermic. So it costs a lot first, and it takes a lot of place.
Okay.
So we're not really.
So I guess the question for me also is that, do we have any planes that are completely electric? Did you guys find any in your research, the planes that are completely electric?
EcoPulse that was presented during le Salon du Bourget in 2019.
Which is a famous air show near Paris.
Yes, and so this one was with six electric motors and one
Thermal engine.
thermal one. So it was efficient, and it was really a good advancement for the transport.
Like air transport.
Industry.
Okay.
But we are still doing researches and improvements, but it's not on the on business.
It's not yet commercializable,
Yes.
right? So there are models, there are prototypes, there's research, but it's not yet something that we can use on a big scale.
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to stay too long on this because we do have a lot of other stuff to talk about, but I'm just curious, what about making better planes, not just completely changing the motor into something that is not carbon producing, but changing the designs? Are there any ideas about that, or changing something about the way it functions?
So basically, the aeronautics world is very expensive in terms of fuel, because kerosene is not cheap.
Right, it's
And
costly to produce.
Yeah, and so society wanted to reduce that cost as much as possible in order to economize money.
Right.
So they are constantly progressing on how to reduce the carbon emissions. So there was modification of the shape of wings, on the size of the motors, or things like that. That have been made in the last 15 years.
So we can improve like the aerodynamics of airplanes, but that's not going to make a huge difference,
Yes,
right?
the biggest part is on the consummation.
Right, like it's a type of fuel that's going to make, if we change that, that's where it's going to make the biggest impact.
Yes.
Okay, so I think Lola wants to say something.
Yes, I think it's important to note that we could also make more efficient routes, optimize flight paths.
You guys mentioned the whole idea of optimizing the air traffic system of the world, which is, what is the problem currently with the way we route airplanes?
Well, the thing is, there could be some. It's not perfect, obviously, and we can optimize it. It's not bad, but we can have problems with how we manage air traffic. We could manage it more efficiently. We could also design airports for energy efficiency and minimize ground operation emissions.
Okay, so these are sort of secondary costs associated with air travel, which is not the airplane itself, right?
Yeah.
But it's needed for the airplanes to be in the air.
And I think that what's important to know is that the actual flying of the airplane isn't what uses most kerosene. It's also the landings, the taking off, and
in
the
general,
airports.
as you guys will see in physics next year, what costs the most in terms of energy is acceleration, right? Is when you have to go from zero to the airspeed, and then when you have to slow down again. Even with cars, even with anything, acceleration is where we use energy, right? principle of inertia that you guys learned about last year comes into play, and a lot of other things. Okay, maybe a final question about, you guys mentioned carbon pricing as something that could be, Clémence?
Yes, because imposing taxes on aviation fuels or introducing environmental charges based on CO2 emissions could encourage airlines to adopt greener practices and invest in cleaner technologies.
Right, so this goes back to a common theme which we heard from the other groups. Is that, okay, so we can improve the technology of something to reduce the carbon emissions, but we can generally change people's behavior as well, right? So if people behave differently, as we saw with the agriculture group, you can do everything you want to reduce the carbon emissions from raising cattle, but the best thing is to stop eating meat, right? So here, what you're talking about is maybe reducing just how much people travel by airplane, right? And it could be by increasing the cost, it could be by making it more difficult, but the problem with that becomes a question of, then the rich people are the ones who are able to do it, and poor people can't, and that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. Okay, have we gone through most of the important points associated with air travel?
Yeah.
All right, so shall we move on to the big contributor, which is land travel, maybe, right? Who wants to maybe give us a short summary of the situation when it comes to land transport? Vadim.
So basically, land transport is the most polluting part of the transport
sector.
Yes, as it represents 70% the emission.
Okay.
Transport.
Can you give us a general idea what we mean by land transport? What are the different types of land transport we're talking about?
In land transport, we are putting cars, truck, motor, everything that is like just using the roads.
Right. So it could be for business reasons, it could be for personal reasons, It could be for just. And you said it's 70% of the total transport emission.
Yes.
Is from the land part. Wow. Okay. Do you have any other ideas about like which countries are the ones who use this more, or no?
In terms of cars pollution, India and the US are
the main contributors.
As India is
very populous,
very populated, and the US is just a very big country. Yeah, and
it's very much in the culture that everybody drives for everything.
A truck that's polluting a lot. So.
Okay. So again, with cars and buses and trucks, the problem is combustion. Right? They use fossil fuels. We burn this. Burning it produces carbon dioxide, goes into the atmosphere. Is there any other thing we should keep in mind when it comes to land transport before we go on to talk about how we can improve and reduce?
That there is a difference between the global emission and the emission per person.
Right. Let's go into some detail.
It's a distinction that you have to make in land transport, because a bus filled with 20 person will pollute more than a car with one person. But divided by the amount of people that you are carrying, it's less important.
Right.
So you have to take a look at how many people are using land transport,
and what each individual is contributing to. Okay. So then, if we compare, for example, the U.S. and India, which are, you said, the top two emitters.
Yes, U.S. is way on top. And
right. If we go by percent. Okay, because in the US, pretty much everybody has a car, and most people are driving cars, and there's much less public transport, whereas in India, most transport is public, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So how can we improve? How can we reduce the carbon emissions from land transport? Let's get to the obvious one that everybody has been doing more and more the last few years, which would be?
Well, we could first implant on-demand transport services.
Right. So have more public transport. So instead of everybody having their own car, we use common sources of transport. Okay.
Yes. And so shared transport, autonomous transport. So exploring the possibilities of it, including autonomous shuttles and on-demand vehicles, can help to improve accessibilities in areas where traditional transport services are limited.
Okay, so let's go straight to the question, which is probably the one question that most people think of when we talk about land transport: electrical cars. Let's get to the question. Do electrical cars, just having electrical vehicles, EVH as we call them now, I guess, or EVs, is that going to make a big difference or not? Is it making a big difference? Is it going to make a big difference? If yes, why? If no, why not?
Well, if when someone uses an electric car, it produces less CO2 emissions than when someone uses a carbon car.
Mm-hmm.
However, the production of the battery for the electric car is polluting.
Right.
Maybe not on CO2 emissions, but with it pollutes with
I guess other greenhouse
water.
gases. I think Lola wants to insert something here.
Yeah, of course, if the electricity comes from, the battery or from coal or other fossil fuels, the emissions from EVs may be comparable to or even higher
So this is
than
the key.
those gasoline
Right.
cars.
This is the key. For example, in France, we've mentioned this at other times, our electricity mostly comes from nuclear, which is carbon zero. Whereas, for example, in a country like, let's say, I don't know, the US, is much more of the electricity comes from non-carbon zero sources. So the same electrical vehicle in France contributes much less. So replacing a fossil fuel car with an electric car makes an actual difference. Whereas if your electricity is coming from carbon emitting sources, then you're just changing where the emissions are coming from, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because obviously promoting renewable energies and improving the efficiency of electricity is essential, are essential steps to maximize the environmental benefits of electric vehicles. But we need to be very careful on the source of electricity used, because it could do more harm than good.
Right. So it could be easy to think that you're helping by buying an electrical vehicle, but if your electricity is coming from impure, improper, not carbon zero sources, you're still making the same carbon emission
Exactly.
as
And
before.
sometimes it might be worse.
Oh, why would it be worse? I'm curious.
Well, if it's from coal or other fossil fuels, it can be it could be.
Right. So you're saying so.
Higher than for
Right. So for example, if we take a country where the electricity is mostly produced by coal, if your car is burning gas or diesel, it's actually giving less carbon into the atmosphere than if it was an electric car, but the electricity was coming from coal. Okay, I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. That is actually, so it could actually be worse. Something to remember when we're buying our first electric cars, maybe. What else? What other improvements have you guys found that would make a dent into the carbon emissions from land transport? Did you guys see anything else which was of note?
Well, so there's the maglev train.
Right, the maglev trains.
So he has a magnetic levitation, which can reduce the carbon impact of land transport, particularly for short to medium distance journeys in region where maglev is available. So because maglev train generally run on electricity, which means they produce fewer direct CO2 emissions, but there's always the problem.
Where does your electricity come from? This is why our first group, which presented their topic on the energy, the energy counts for 3/4 of all our emissions, right? Because in the end, what we use most for energy is electricity, and the question is, where does electricity come from? And unfortunately, most of the electricity we produce is still not very clean.
Sorry, with maglev, so there is less energy losses because they use magnetic levitation, so they are not losing like friction energy.
Because I was going to ask you, why not just trains? We could have more trains, right? Electric trains, which is still better. But you're saying that with maglev trains, it's also reducing I guess it's increasing the efficiency of the train because you're losing less through friction, which would be the case of normal trains, even if they are electric.
Yes.
Okay. It is costly though, right?
Yeah.
And it's a pretty complex infrastructure to build and to put into place. So do you know of any countries which use maglev trains for like their daily transport?
I think that Japan has tried to build one line.
Yeah.
And they also built completely like a train in the tunnel without any air inside in order to avoid air.
This was the famous Hyperloop idea that got a lot of people excited about 10 years ago when I guess Elon Musk was the one coming up with it. Yeah, Lola?
Those ideas are really good, but they can only be implemented because Japan obviously has enough money to do so. But it's important to note that progress may vary in different parts of the world depending on political priorities.
High-tech, the high-tech sector, which is able to. It's a very complex project. Okay. So you're saying that depends too much on the political factors.
Yeah, well, the political factors or the existing infrastructures or economic conditions, just basically.
Which is true of pretty much anything we can say at any point for any of the topics, right? But in this case, particularly just because it is a very complex project. I remember even when I was your age, so many centuries ago, there was the idea, it was proposed of building a Hyperloop-like train going from London to New York, like a tunnel. Under the ocean, which was completely in a vacuum, and it would be able to do, a train would be able to do this distance in 2 hours, right? This was a project which obviously never was worked on, but this idea of trains going through tunnels which are completely devoid of air in order to reduce or take away almost all of the resistance from friction that you can have is an idea that's been going around for a long time. The problem is the difficulty of such projects. Okay. Any final words on land transfer, because we are kind of running out of time and we still haven't talked about maritime.
Well, I think that's it.
That's all the main points. So if I take away the main point, one, it's better to have more people using less and sharing the transport. That makes a huge difference. So public transport. So in this case, I guess cities are much better than like living out in the country.
Yes.
Because in the country, everything is far away. In the city, you can go in places much more closer with public transport or on foot. So we should have more cities. That's very good in that sense, right?
But in cities, there are buildings, and buildings are polluting a lot.
Right, but that's for the building group to worry about. That's not for you guys to worry about. Okay, and the second thing, if I can keep just do the summary, we should go to electrical vehicles in general, as long as the electricity is clean.
It depends on the electricity.
Okay, I think you wanted to add a final point.
No, I would say that, cities are really important, and we can make more walkable cities, and just, of course, we can work on making our transports less polluting, but we can also use them less.
Well, one of the things we compare between like European cities and North American cities, the European cities are much more walkable in general, whereas in North America, even if you want to go like, 500 meters or a kilometer away, you end up taking a car, right? It's just a cultural thing, but it's also the way cities have been built, right? European cities in general, or many of the older cities were built before there were cars, so they were conceived for being more, I guess, pedestrian friendly, whereas the more modern cities were built after the inception of the car. Okay, so let's get to the third part of your transport sector, which would be maritime. So everything that's going by the sea. Who wants to introduce us to the problems of maritime transport, and then we get into the solutions? Pauline.
So maritime transports are 4% of the emissions. Like there's 28% are from transport in the global carbon emissions, and in this 28%, only 13.5% are from maritime transports. So it is a sector that is often forgotten in the old transport industry, but it is important as it can it is linked with tourism, with also economy, and even when you want to even with the food of people, as when you were.
So let me ask you a question. Do you have an idea of what percentage of maritime transport is more like tourism and like individual, and what percentage is for commerce? Like, 'cause I always get the impression in my head that most of maritime transport is to transport goods, to take stuff from China, bring it to Europe, take stuff from Europe, take it to South America. So for transporting goods, do you have any numbers if that's true? Whether it's mostly for commercial reasons or it's mostly for touristic reasons?
I think it's mostly for commercial reasons. as most of the people that are using boats have that's their personal boats.
Right.
And most of the times it's a small one.
It's a very small number of people who have boats of that kind.
And the boats are not that big, and they are not always using engine. So
and I guess in this case, the individual carbon emissions would be very high for those people having like boats, but there are so few of them that the overall contribution is almost.
So that's why we are not looking at. We are mostly looking at shipping because it's the main.
Right, we're talking about the big giant shipping boats, which take like hundreds of containers that take product stuff that's been produced in one place and to be sold in other places. Lola, I think you wanted to add something to that?
Cargo shipping is constitute about 80 or 90% of all maritime transport, so obviously these CO2 emissions are going to look something like that.
Okay, so 80 to 90% of all maritime transport is shipping and cargo shipping, so basically commercial use. All right, I think Pauline, you wanted to continue with the few.
We have to forget the cruises that are also emitting a lot, that is contributing to tourism, but there is so much carbon emissions in the boat and that the boat is producing that it causes also a lot of pollution.
You also mentioned that one of the main problems with maritime transport isn't necessarily carbon dioxide, but it's mostly nitric oxide and sulfur oxides.
Yes, it's like the main issue with those maritime transport isn't that much the production of CO2. It's because while using those and the boat engine, it's producing molecules like NO2 or
SO2.
Yeah, that are augmenting the acidification of the ocean, and that means a degradation of the maritime ecosystem. And this is the main factors. That's the main problem with those transport.
Okay, so let's quickly move on to what solutions may exist to make maritime transport less polluting, even though I get the impression that since it's not the biggest contributor, the solutions aren't the ones that are going to make the biggest difference necessarily. Maybe one or two ideas,
one of the ideas that was once put on the table was using nuclear motor
which we already have, but only in military.
For aircraft carrier, for example, on container carrier. But this idea is like not realistic because field aircraft carrier has a weight of approximately 100,000 tons. Whereas a field container carrier is 360,000 tons.
Okay.
So putting those nuclear engine into those boats, it will be like putting a F1 engine into a forklifter.
Right.
That just doesn't make sense.
It's a good analogy.
And lastly, those engine are absolutely not adapted to. They are very different, and the cost of production and amelioration will be way higher. Because you'll have to produce way more engine, as there is only 12 nuclear aircraft carrier in the world.
Right. I guess the idea would be that produce the same sort of nuclear engines, but smaller, maybe more compact, or in some sort of a more streamlined way to make it less costly. Just because we are kind of short on time. Any final points? Because we have a few questions from your classmates that I wanted to get to.
No, I think we can, if we're kind of...
Okay, so I think we've gone through pretty much most of it. There's so much information, obviously, and it's such an important thing because transport is basically what has made modern human society what it is today. Before, everybody stuck around where they were, and now everybody's moving around. All right, so let's get to a couple of questions that your classmates had. How about some questions also about air traffic control? What are some incentives for better air traffic or flight practices?
Well, that's what I was saying. It's to impose taxes or...
What sort of taxes? On what?
So taxes on aviation fuels or introducing environmental charges based on CO2 emissions. We could also offer subsidies or financial incentives to airlines that invest in more fuel efficiency aircraft.
Right. Okay. So if I understand correctly, your idea is that we make it in the interest of the technical, the technological side of things to change the way we work in terms of type of fuels, type of planes, and all these things. Okay. There was another question about the project you mentioned between Safran and Airbus on the hydrogen-powered aircraft. So it's slated to come out in 2050. The question was, is it really possible to bring out something so radically different in that time frame? Is it possible sooner to produce it in mass? Pauline?
For in mass, but I think it's possible for 2050. As Rolls-Royce did a hydrogen plane with they did it, and they managed to make it possible to use it in a more larger scale. And nowadays the improvements are getting really bigger and bigger as the technology is also improving itself. So it is possible. It has its own challenges, as if we have to stock the hydrogen, we need to put it in pipeline. So we
need a whole infrastructure that's surrounded. You can't just have a plane like this if you don't have the infrastructure to produce, to transport, to distribute the hydrogen.
We would have to change all the
infrastructure.
Yeah, the infrastructure of the airports and the airplane.
Okay. So, because we're going to be out of time very, very quickly, any final points? Is there anything you guys want to talk about that we didn't bring up? Any particular personal, things that marked you or you found interesting, you learned?
I think that the most important thing to share with people is to raise them awareness about transport emission, to help them choosing the most available transport.
Which is the most efficient way.
Yes.
Any other comments?
I would say we can talk a lot about creating new trains and new planes, but at the end of the day, just choosing to take the subway rather than our car for the same time of transport.
Or not take 4 flights a year on vacations when you can.
Not be Taylor Swift. We can all use our time and our energy to go towards more eco-friendly solutions.
All right. So thank you very much to all 4 of you. It was a really good talk and we learned a lot.
Thank you.
So that is Physics Bites for this week. We do hope that you enjoyed this episode. But before we say goodbye, like usual, it's your turn to think about what we just listened to and answer the following question. What is, in your opinion, the best way to limit and reduce carbon emissions from the transport sector? Is it to buy an electric car? Is it to have more public transport? Is it to just stop traveling around? Let us know what you think about this in our comments section. And tune in next week for a brand new episode of Physics Bites.